What is up? I'm Jared Harris, and this is episode 10 of Beats by Jer. That's right, double digits. If you've been with me since July, thank you for listening, and if you're new, welcome. Today, we'll be looking at September 24th, 1991, and its significance to popular music. September 24th, 1991 marks a prolific day for new releases. On this date, 32 years and 1 day ago, the 90s truly began. This is the day that marked the beginning of a cultural shift which saw the counterculture flip into the mainstream. We could see this through the examination of 3 major albums all released on this day. A Tribe Called Quest, The Low End Theory, Nirvana's Nevermind, and the Red Hot Chili Peppers' Blood Sugar Sex Magik. It is through this trio of records that we can see a shift in cultural values and musical consumption, how a collective sought alternative styles in lieu of the mass commodification of art, and how fringe culture overtook the mainstream. Now I know what you're thinking. How could the 90s have begun 3/4 of the way into 1991? We often organize cultural eras into decades. This is a clean means of assembling cultural movements that include everything from social norms and values to music, film, slang, fashion, technology, new advances, customs, population trends, really anything and everything that affects the influx and flow and development of culture, of society. We can look at the 1960s as an example and the imagery that is conjured with this. The Flower Child movement, the Beatles, Hendrix, Woodstocks, the hippie lifestyle and free love and oppression of the war in Vietnam. There is a vibe to the 1960s, but really, everything I said and what likely came to your mind occurred within a 7-year span. The first Beatles single, Love Me Do, was released on October 5th, 1992, and Woodstock took place in August of 1969. There are books dedicated to this idea of how we group social, cultural eras. Robin Morgan and Ariel Levy published 1963, The Year of the Revolution, making the case that the 1960s, as we collectively remember them and are nostalgic for, despite most of us not being alive or old enough to enjoy it for what it was, kicks off in 1963. They came to this conclusion by looking at music from the Beatles, the Dave Clark Five, the Stones, along with the blooming art styles of pop art and social realism, looking at the work of Warhol and many other artists, combined with a string of social movements from anti-war, civil rights to women's suffrage. In addition to this, rapidly changing fashion and the sexual revolution led by the accessibility of the pill, youth culture was progressing at an unprecedented rate, largely contributed to the first wave of baby boomers coming of age. It was the largest generational force in human history, and not only were norms and values changing with the advent of so much in so many different industries, but all of this was happening at an incredibly fast and unpredictable rate. By this logic, then, we can look at the 60s peaking in the summer of 69 with Woodstock, which can be seen as a culmination of the decade's various movements. Flower power meets anti-war, alongside with a series of new artists who would set the tone for popular music for the decade to come. Of course, we're talking about Hendrix, Sly and the Family Stone, The Who, and Santana, among many others. Only months later, on December 6, would the 60s come to an end with the Altamont Free Concert, a West Coast response to Woodstock. The show was led by the Rolling Stones and used the Hells Angels biker gang, motorcycle club, as security and resulted in the deaths of 4 different people. Musicologists and sociologists alike seem to unanimously agree that this is what shattered the vision of the 1960s. Similarly, David Hepworth wrote Never a Dull Moment, 1971, the year that rock exploded. and in doing so made the case that what we associate with the 70s from a musical perspective truly came to form in 1971 and continued until about 1978. Hepworth's thesis looks at the explosion of rock and how the genre grew to massive heights compared to that of the Beatles and the Stones a decade prior. Furthermore, the music had become louder with the advance of speaker technology and distortion, along with the use of more mature themes taking hold of the genre. There's a reason we consider Zeppelin and Sabbath as 70s bands, despite both releasing their debut records in 1969. There's a sound to the 70s, and this era begins to close with the glam rock movement, which starts to take hold towards the later half of the decade, paving the way for the 80s commercial boom. This in itself sets the stage for the 90s. The late 70s and early 80s saw a range of bands grow in popularity. Motley Crue, Poison, Rat, Warrant, Skid Row, that whole Los Angeles Sunset Strip glam, heavy metal, rock scene. It was almost taking what Zeppelin and Aerosmith had done, but louder and faster, and largely to a lesser extent. Less blues homage for the new generation and more shred with a certain pop polish that, despite being marketed by the record labels as heavy metal, was clearly a production tool for labels to have rock bands compete with the status of some of the biggest pop artists ever. By the late 80s, this style became a parody of itself. Labels saw how much money there was in this style and continued to sign bands with little coaching or A&R work in an attempt to find quick hits. This led to the over-commodification of the style, one that was becoming ever so watered down as the decade went on. You simply had more and more artists releasing albums at fast rates without enough time to develop songwriting or their themselves to their audience. And the more releases came out, the less they resonated with their audience, the more they felt like hollow attempts at what had been done earlier in the decade. There's something a little recycled about hard rock of the late 80s from that scene. Earlier this year, I actually interviewed Steel Panther's drummer Sticks It In Ya about their upcoming record. And of course, anyone that knows Steel Panther knows that they are known as being the 80s band of today, right? They play into that 80s vibe visually, aesthetically, musically, in every way. The only thing that doesn't make them an 80s band is that they started in the late 2000s, early 2010s. But I interviewed Styx for the Spill magazine, and he eloquently reflected on the late 80s, stating the following. 1987, heavy metal was at its pinnacle. You had 83 where it really started, and by 87 it was peaking right before it ate its own ass and got pitiful. Now that's coming from someone whose career is based around the genre of the 80s. Running parallel to this was a growing punk and alternative rock scene, largely stemming from that of the Stooges in the late 60s and early 70s, the alternative influence of David Bowie's mid to late 70s output, and the punk explosion of 76 led by the Sex Pistols. While pockets of counterculture movements spread across most major cities, Los Angeles would be the central hub for this. Mark Spitz and Brendan Mullen explore this in their book, We Got the Neutron Bomb, The Untold Story of L.A. Punk. The oral history collects the memories of those who were actually there from the late 70s into the late 80s and early 90s, following bands like The Germs, X, Black Flag, Circle Jerks. The narrative concludes with The Germs guitarist Pat Smear getting the call to join Nirvana as a touring guitarist. And of course, not in the book, but Smear would famously go on to join the Foo Fighters. And upon their induction to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2021, Dave Grohl probably said it best, "Holy shit, the guitar player from the Germs is in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame." The Pat Smear is just this eternally wonderful presence and a great addition to the Foo Fighters, and the way that Grohl looks up to him as the guy who, still like the kid playing drums in Nirvana looking up to the guitarist of the Germs is it's heartwarming. It's really nice. That being said, this idea of this counterculture, it's further examined in another book from Brendan Mullen, Whores, an oral history of Perry Farrell and Jane's addiction. Once again, using the voices of those who were there, Mullen looks at the Los Angeles alternative rock scene, largely following that of Jane's addiction's contributions and ascent, but also provides a fascinating look at the other major players in the 1980s LA club scene: Fishbone, Thelonious Monster, and the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Even cooler, much of his interviews feature some of the Seattle grunge legends of the 90s, reflecting on the importance of this scene. This, of course, includes conversations with members of Pearl Jam and Chris Cornell. These two books look at the growing wave of musicians making art in a state of reaction to what was becoming ever increasingly popular and profitable. It's almost anti-capitalist, anti-consumerist, the pursuit of art and creativity for the very sake of it, rather than seeking the attention and dollars of the populace. There's a level of purity to this era that is unlikely to ever happen again, just because of the way the music industry is set up these days. But it's something that made this community, this DIY approach, undeniably cool. I have not lost sight of where this episode is headed. Nobody could have predicted what the 90s would have looked like. The labels certainly couldn't have, as 1991 flipped the entire game on its head, leaving them to play catch-up. If this roundabout introduction is to serve anything, let it be two things. First, context. Coming out of the 80s, the music industry had never been as big as it was, from pop icons like Prince, Michael Jackson, Madonna, to the 80s rock bands Motley Crue, Guns N' Roses, Van Halen, and the 70s rock titans who remained larger than ever: Springsteen, Tom Petty, Queen. The music industry was printing money. Despite this, however, rock music was becoming largely stale from an artistic standpoint towards the end of the 80s. New artists simply weren't making the same splash that their predecessors were, and they certainly weren't a hit on the road. Secondly, and perhaps most importantly, let this be a reminder that the 1991 Cultural Revolution was not one of a single artist or a singular moment. This negates and minimizes the work of nearly 2 decades of punk and alternative rock, musicians who are championed as heroes by those of the 90s. No, what happened in 1991 was not that of a single person, but a culmination of nearly 20 years of music reaching a tipping point amid changing values among an incredibly tired musical landscape. Let us begin with A Tribe Called Quest, The Low End Theory. This album as a whole represents less of the cultural shift we associate with the 90s, but more in general a pursuit for alternative takes of what was growing increasingly popular. As hip-hop became bigger and bigger and bigger into the 90s, largely due to the gangster rap of NWA, along with massive releases from the likes of Public Enemy, there was an increase in demand for the genre. This is a sidestep from what rock was going through, but is no less important. The low-end theory opens with the walking bass line of Excursions and the unique timbre and flow of Q-Tip. The album sees Phife Dawg take a more present role, almost an equal to that of Tip, rather than as a glorified hype man. The chemistry between these two is among the best in hip-hop and excels past that of the sounds and energy of their debut album. For a sophomore record, Low End Theory avoids any pitfalls and truly soars. It's a remarkably influential moment for the genre. With Ron Carter featured on the record, the Ron Carter, the most recorded bassist of ever, the acclaimed jazz bassist, one of the best of the best. With Ron Carter featured on the record, there is an element of jazz brought to the album, and even on a vast majority of the album, which does not actually feature Carter, there is something to the samples, the beats, the production that lends itself to jazz. The instrumentation is organic, it grooves, it bounces, and it supports tip and fife like a rhythm section would support a soloist on the bandstand. This record would set the tone for alternative hip-hop artists like Outkast, The Roots, and to some extent the likes of Run the Jewels and Kendrick Lamar. Highlights include Excursions, Check the Rhyme, Jazz, We've Got, Vibes and Stuff, and Scenario, but there really is not a weak moment on the Low End Theory. Through the work of Q-Tip and Phife Dawg, we can see that there was a massive desire for something different. Alternative hip-hop would go on to blossom throughout the 90s with future releases from Tribe, De La Soul, Outkast, and the Beastie Boys. And we can look at the success of the Low End Theory as what sparked this phenomenon. Unlike rock, hip-hop wasn't growing tired, but the genre by 1991 was a burgeoning canvas, one that was at a make-or-break moment. As gangster rap grew omnipresent, there was a moment that the genre could have become constrained by the stylistic guidelines of the genre. There was so much money in gangster rap, there was so much influence in it, that it was almost suffocating the style, right, and limiting what hip-hop could have been. Instead, artists and the audience alike sought to expand hip-hop into new and exciting territories. Looking beyond the genre, I like to think of the Low End Theory as representing a greater aspect of pop culture, something that was among the social consciousness of the time among youth culture, something bigger than hip-hop entirely. The Low End Theory is a triumph for the genre as a whole, one which ushered in a wave of artists who otherwise would not have been able to find massive levels of success, but it also speaks to the values that alternative music as a whole had. Maybe it has to do with the context of the industry at the time. There was more money and value in experimentation and risk-taking, and with more money means that if it flops, an artist can still find viability afterwards, whereas now we reward the successful risk-takers with massive careers, and those who pave the way with less successful experiments and attempts likely are lost in the noise of our ever-flooded content-devouring attention spans. Regardless, September 24th, 1991 marked a special moment for alternative hip-hop. This brings us to Nevermind, the breakthrough sophomore album from Nirvana. Despite the modest success of 1989's Bleach, Nirvana was not a phenomenon or the leaders of a movement. They were just another punk band, only one showing much more promise. Nirvana took the world by storm, making Kurt Cobain the voice of a generation, and Nirvana setting the defined sounds for 90s rock. Distorted guitars, rough vocals, aggressive and sometimes abrasive tones, and roots that clearly reside in punk music. Nevermind, however, was not an overnight success. In fact, despite the special attention I am giving to September 24th, 1991, it took quite some time before Nevermind really caught on. At the time of its release, Nirvana was touring with the Chili Peppers in the middle of a 3-band bill, with either Pearl Jam or the Smashing Pumpkins opening and the Chili Peppers headlining. A simple aside, this is one of those moments where if I had a time machine, I would hit this tour up. In this examination of the impact a single day can have on pop culture, Nirvana Nevermind represents the actual shift, the changing of the guard, the introduction of a new generational voice for the wave of teens who simply weren't resonating with pop or rock in the late 80s. The success of Nevermind was unprecedented. Much like the rise of Guns N' Roses just a few years earlier, Nirvana quickly became among the biggest bands in the world all within the next year. A conversation about grunge or the 90s as a whole that omits Cobain is simply incomplete. The role in which he took in the 90s was that of John Lennon to the 60s, a prolific songwriter whose public persona was one that simply went against all expectations of the time. Cobain was anti-celebrity, something which probably only furthered his celebrity status in that it made him feel relatable. But his whole vibe inspired the next wave of rock stars, or, anti-rock stars, if you will. His reluctancy spoke to his creativity and his punk roots, and signified a sense of integrity that few in such a level of fame have ever demonstrated. Nevermind was propelled by its singles, In Bloom, Lithium, and of course the monster mega hit, Smells Like Teen Spirit, an anthem for a generation, a song which will forever represent an era of music, and the band's anti-presentation through the music video was something to behold. The sound of the album was as much in tune with punk rock as it was with the melodies of the Beatles, and it was this contrast, the soft and heavy, that would become a defining factor of grunge. The album featured a slightly polished edge, which I would say comes largely from producer Butch Vig, and certainly helped with the mainstream appeal. For me, I prefer Nirvana at their heaviest, right? Looking at songs like Territorial Pissing, In Bloom, Stay Away, but also at their absolute softest. Lithium, Polly, and the guttural emptiness that is Something in the Way. Few artists, if anyone, could conquer such extremes to such equal degrees. Like I said, Nevermind, despite Smells Like Teen Spirit, was not an overnight success. The album wouldn't make it to the #1 spot on the Billboard charts, despite going platinum in November 1991, until January 11th, 1992. This in itself is a unique feat, as it's rare for albums to continue climbing the charts over a prolonged period of time, and at that rate, even hitting #1. This speaks to the notion of a growing wave that spread from counterculture into the mainstream. These revolutions don't happen overnight. Even more impressive, in taking the #1 spot, Nirvana had actually dethroned Michael Jackson's Dangerous, and it was estimated to be selling roughly 300,000 copies a week. It has since gone on to sell over 30 million copies, making it among the greatest selling albums ever. As I've mentioned in previous episodes, it could be a dangerous game to compare art to its sales metrics and to extrapolate its value based on how much it's sold. But when we're working in the context of social cultural movements and such drastic shifts from what was in the 80s and what the 90s would become, these metrics are important pieces of evidence that illustrate the value that society placed on this art at the time. That in itself does not tell us the value of the art itself, but it carried social currency in 1991 and 1992. Nevermind ushered in a massive wave of grunge and alternative music that was to come. However, in 1991, it truly was the tip of the spear that pushed this movement forward. It's important to note that 91 was a huge year for releases, further emphasizing the importance of Nevermind, while also reminding us that September 24th, 1991 was a point of culmination. The year featured Pearl Jam's 10, Soundgarden's Bad Motorfinger, Smashing Pumpkins' Gish, Temple of the Dog's Self-Titled, REM's Out of Time, among so many other releases. Essential listening to understand the 90s alternative rock wave. While it is clear that these influential and important albums did not follow suit of Nirvana, their success and the success of their respective artists very much relied on the wave which Nirvana ushered. This in itself begs the question, however, could another album at the right place and time have done so? Without discrediting Nirvana in any way, this was a cultural tipping point, and Nevermind happened to have enough momentum to actually push counterculture in the mainstream. But could someone else have done it? Just food for thought, just an idea. If we're going off the basis that cultural movements like this are not the results of singular people, but rather the work of the many, the work of the countless, it does beg the question if another record from that time could have done what Nevermind did. It's a curious thought. Regardless, if anything from this episode is clear, it's that September 24th, 1991 was a point that was built up to from the works of countless artists. To me, no album or band best demonstrates that specific idea than Blood Sugar Sex Magik by the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Formed in 1982 by Anthony Kiedis and Flea, along with a revolving lineup of guitarists and drummers until securing Hilo Slovak and Jack Irons, the band were a live hit. Their fusion of funk and punk with slight splashes of psychedelia was truly unique among the Los Angeles club scene, and even more so across all of their contemporaries of the 80s and 90s. Their albums, however, never really caught on. With each release, their self-titled, the George Clinton-produced Freaky Styley, the essential but underrated and forgotten Uplift Mofo Party Plan, and Mother's Milk, the album which introduced the current and strongest lineup featuring guitarist John Frusciante and drummer Chad Smith. Each release saw the band slowly reaching new audiences and the tours getting bigger and bigger, but never beyond that of small theaters. This in itself, this slow-burning crescendo, speaks to the very nature of the 1980s alternative rock scene as it climbed towards September 24th, 1991. Cultural movements aren't born in a day, and if we learned anything from Nevermind, they take a whole lot of momentum to break on through. Blood Sugar Sex Magik is a masterpiece, one of the greatest albums ever written, recorded, and performed. A perfect synthesis of hard funk and classic rock with punk and hip-hop influences. It is equal parts a snapshot of what the band was and who they were still to come. The album sounded like the band had found their sound, finally capturing and harnessing their live energy into something on record, something they'd been hinting at and alluding to with each song previously, but had never fully reached. Blood Sugar Sex Magik was the Red Hot Chili Peppers fully formed, the final evolution of their earliest era before changing entirely. The hits Under the Bridge, Suck My Kiss, and Give It Away are timeless. Additional favorites include The Power of Equality, Funky Monks, I Could Have Lied, Sir Psycho Sexy, Fellowship, Slinky in B Major, and the title track. And of course, I'd be remiss to forget Soul to Squeeze, which was recorded during these sessions, but wouldn't be released until 1993 on the Conehead soundtrack. Now, would Blood Sugar Sex Magik have had the same impact as Nevermind had Nevermind been released later? It's very unlikely. Would the album have been a huge success? Absolutely. If anything, we see that the Chili Peppers are elder statesmen of alternative rock by 1991, representing a scene, a culture, a community that had cut its teeth from the early 80s in the punk clubs of LA. I truly believe, culturally, that Blood Sugar Sex Magik is as relevant as Nevermind, not in the context of ushering in the cultural shift that would define 90s popular music, but in the context of a single record representing all that had come before. If Nevermind was the sound of what was to come, Blood Sugar Sex Magik was the sound that paved the way and simultaneously looked forward at what was yet to be heard. This is where the importance of Blood Sugar Sex Magik lies. The album is vital to understanding the cultural context which made the success of Nevermind possible, and to a greater extent understanding how the 90s could see such a drastic shift away from that of the 80s. Blood Sugar Sex Magik represents the work that made such a flip happen in the first place. A real tortoise in the hare situation, if you will. This is why September 24th, 1991 is such an important moment for popular music. This was the day that saw the efforts of nearly 2 decades of outcasts and fringe movements taking hold of the mainstream, entering the social consciousness and steering the decade away from that of the 1980s. Like all cycles, the 90s, not the actual 90s, but what we long for in our nostalgia for that era, eventually came to an end. Most would agree that this was around 97 or 98. It took the label some time to catch on. After all, 91 left them truly stunned. Seriously, who could have predicted it? But by the later half of the decade, grunge and alt-rock began to become over-commodified, with labels signing any band that could sound remotely like Pearl Jam. Even if you don't believe this is what killed the 90s, by Woodstock 1999, a hollow imitation of the original festival that resulted in a massive violence, sexual assaults, and arson, it was all over. At no fault to the artists who pioneered the genres, alternative rock and grunge became the very thing that it sought to overcome. Like a hero living long enough to become the villain, the genre, which was a reaction to over-commercialization, became just that, as labels threw deals at any garage band that could harness a single ounce of angst in search for the next big thing, with little concern for sustainability and market saturation. This speaks further to the importance of September 24th, 1991, a time that carried such a sense of purity. And despite the massive success all 3 records discussed, these projects were a labor of passion, art for art's sake, something which resonated with a disengaged generation and challenged all expectations set by popular music. There's something so special to this. Rarely, if ever, do moments like this exist. There are a number of lessons to be learned. For starters, cultural movements and genres all have a lifespan, and nothing lasts forever. Life operates in cycles, and we can fight this all we want, but the universe continues forward, with or without us. Second, we can look at what this means to art, how easy it is for art to become overly commodified, and with that, disingenuine, but also how it could be made accessible on the entire flip side of this notion. If commodification of the value of art is a spectrum, then punk rock and alternative music lies on the opposite end of this.